Sarah Blackwood sat at her desk, the harsh glow of her computer screen illuminating her face in the otherwise dark apartment. Outside, Chicago's winter wind howled against her windows, rattling the glass panes like impatient fingers. At 32, Sarah had built a respectable career as a historical photograph conservator at the Chicago Historical Society, where she specialized in restoring damaged images from the late 19th century. Tonight, she was working on a particularly challenging restoration project that had been commissioned by the wealthy Davidson family. The photograph, dated 1897, showed the original Davidson family standing in front of their mansion in Lake Forest. The patriarch, William Davidson, stood proud in a tailored suit, his wife Elizabeth beside him in a high-necked dress, and their 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and 2 girls arranged neatly in front of them. Sarah zoomed in on the image, carefully removing spots of damage and enhancing details. Her expertise with the specialized software allowed her to reveal nuances that had been lost to time and deterioration. As she worked on the oldest boy, Thomas, according to her notes, something struck her as odd. She zoomed in further on the area around his feet. "What the hell?" she muttered, leaning closer to the screen. The shadow cast by Thomas didn't align with his body. While the other family members' shadows fell predictably to their right, Thomas's shadow extended at a different angle, as if belonging to someone or something else entirely. Sarah checked the photograph for signs of manipulation, but found none. This wasn't a modern edit. The anomaly was present in the original photograph. Sarah's phone buzzed, startling her. It was Michael, her colleague at the society. "You're still working on that Davidson photo?" "It's almost midnight," he said when she answered. "Michael, there's something weird about this picture. The boy's shadow, it doesn't match. Probably just damage or a quirk of the lighting. Those old photos had long exposure times. People moved." "No, this is different," Sarah insisted. "I need to look into this more." After hanging up, Sarah opened her browser and began searching for information about the Davidson family. The more she read, the more unsettled she became. According to newspaper archives, the Davidson family had been prominent in Chicago society until a mysterious decline. Beginning in 1898, just months after this photograph was taken, Sarah looked back at Thomas's face, his eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for a child of perhaps 10 years. The shadow behind him stretched longer than it should have, its outline distorted into something that didn't quite resemble a young boy. As Sarah continued her research, she discovered that Thomas Davidson had died unexpectedly in 1898, followed shortly by his younger brother James. The newspapers had reported it as typhoid fever, but private letters she found in the Historical Society's archives hinted at something more disturbing. Sarah saved her work and closed her laptop. As she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the image of Thomas's mismatched shadow from her mind. She told herself it was just a photographic anomaly, nothing more. But in the darkness of her bedroom, with the wind still battering her windows, Sarah couldn't help but feel that she had stumbled upon something that perhaps should have remained buried in the past. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Chicago Historical Society early, eager to continue her research on the Davidson family. The Society's massive archive room was quiet. The only sound, the gentle hum of the climate control system, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity needed to preserve the delicate documents. "You look like you haven't slept," Michael commented as he passed her desk, coffee in hand. "I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph," Sarah admitted. "I found some strange things in the family history." Michael pulled up a chair. "Like what?" "Both boys died within months of each other after this photo was taken. The family fortune collapsed soon after. And there's something else. Look at these." Sarah pulled out several letters she had discovered in the archives, written by Elizabeth Davidson to her sister in Boston. "Thomas is not himself." Michael read aloud from one letter dated 2 weeks after the photograph was taken. "Since the day of the portrait, he speaks differently, knows things he shouldn't. James will not go near him. I fear something has happened that I cannot explain." Sarah nodded grimly. "And look at this one from a month later. Last night I saw Thomas standing at the foot of our bed. When William lit the lamp, the boy's shadow remained on the wall for several seconds after he had gone." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah, these are just the writings of a 19th century woman whose son was probably ill. They attributed all sorts of things to spirits and possessions back then." "I know how it sounds," Sarah said defensively. But what about the shadow in the photograph? That's not superstition, it's right there in the image." "Let me see it again," Michael sighed. Sarah opened her laptop and showed him her enhanced version of the photograph. Michael studied it carefully, his skepticism slowly giving way to confusion. "That's unusual," he admitted, "but there must be a rational explanation." Maybe the glass plate negative was damaged in that spot. I thought of that, Sarah replied. But the damage would have affected the entire image vertically, not just the shadow. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly man at their desk. He introduced himself as Harold Winters, the Society's longest-serving archivist, now retired but occasionally visiting to assist with special projects. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, his voice thin with age. You're working on the Davidson photograph? Sarah nodded. Do you know anything about it? Harold's roomy eyes flickered with what might have been apprehension. That photograph has a history here at the Society. The last 3 people who worked extensively with it resigned their positions shortly afterward. I've always felt there was something ... not right about it. Michael rolled his eyes slightly, but Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. What happened to them, the people who worked on it? Different things. One had a nervous breakdown. Another claimed she was being followed by a child she could only see from the corner of her eye. The third simply disappeared, left Chicago altogether. Harold shook his head. Perhaps just coincidences. Do you know where the photograph was taken? Sarah asked. The Davidson mansion in Lake Forest. It's still standing, though it's changed hands many times. No family has stayed there longer than a decade. Harold paused. They say it's because of the boys' room, the one that always feels cold no matter how much they heat it. The Davidson mansion loomed against the gray afternoon sky, its Victorian architecture imposing despite years of renovations by subsequent owners. Sarah had convinced Michael to drive her to Lake Forest, using the pretense of needing more context for her restoration work. I can't believe I let you talk me into this, Michael muttered as they pulled up to the wrought iron gate. This is how horror movies start, you know. Or professional historians investigating a historical property, Sarah replied, though she couldn't quite keep the nervousness from her voice. Besides, the current owners agreed to the tour. The present owners, the Clarks, were a middle-aged couple who had purchased the mansion 3 years earlier. Mrs. Clark met them at the door, elegant in a cashmere sweater that suggested the family's considerable wealth. It's always nice to meet people interested in the history of the house, she said as she led them through the grand foyer. Though I must admit, your call about the Davidson family photograph intrigued me. We've found very little documentation from that era. The Davidsons were the original owners, Sarah explained, looking around at the ornate woodwork that had survived more than a century of renovations. We're restoring a family portrait taken right before a tragedy struck the family. Mrs. Clark's smile faltered slightly. Yes, well, old houses like this one have their share of sad stories. The realtor was quite forthcoming about the property's history, 2 children dying of illness, the family's financial ruin. It's all very 19th century. Do you know where the photograph might have been taken? Michael asked, his professional curiosity temporarily overriding his skepticism. Probably in the main parlor. It's through here. Mrs. Clark guided them into a spacious room with tall windows overlooking the lake. Most of the original features have been preserved, though we've updated the decor, of course. Sarah pulled out her tablet and opened the photograph. Yes, I think this is it. The windows match and that fireplace is distinctive. She positioned herself where the photographer would have stood, looking at the modern room through the lens of the historical image. The family had stood just there in front of the fireplace. Thomas, with his misaligned shadow, had been positioned on the right side. Mrs. Clark, Sarah said carefully, has anything unusual ever happened in this house since you moved in? The woman's polite smile became fixed. What do you mean, unexplained occurrences? Cold spots? Anything that might seem... Sarah hesitated, aware of Michael's warning glance. ... out of the ordinary. Mrs. Clark was silent for a moment, then sighed. My husband would be furious if he heard me talking about this. He's very rational, very scientific. But since you ask, there have been incidents. What kind of incidents? Michael asked, his tone softer now. Our son's room, it was originally one of the Davidson children's rooms, is always cold. We've had 3 different heating specialists look at it, and none can explain why. And sometimes, she paused, looking embarrassed, sometimes my son says he sees another boy in his room at night, a boy in old-fashioned clothes who stands in the corner and watches him. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the well-heated room. Could you show us that room? She asked. Mrs. Clark led them upstairs to a bedroom at the end of the hallway. Despite the warm air flowing from the vents, Sarah could feel the temperature drop as they entered. This was Thomas Davidson's room, Mrs. Clark said quietly, according to the house records. Sarah moved to the center of the room, turning slowly. Her eyes were drawn to the corner opposite the door, a space where the shadows seemed somehow deeper than they should have been in the well-lit room. The shadow in the photograph, she said, almost to herself, it wasn't just misaligned. It was elongated, distorted, almost as if ... double quotes, as if what? Michael prompted, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Sarah met his eyes, her theory suddenly crystallizing, as if something else was casting it, something standing behind Thomas that didn't appear in the photograph. Back at her apartment that evening, Sarah pored over every bit of information she had gathered about the Davidson family. The more she learned, the more disturbing the picture became. According to Elizabeth Davidson's letters, Thomas's behavior had changed dramatically after the day of the photograph. He had become withdrawn, speaking rarely but making disturbing statements when he did. One letter particularly chilled Sarah. Thomas told James that he was just visiting in Thomas's body, and that soon he would need to find another place to stay. James came to me crying, saying Thomas's eyes looked different, like someone else was looking out. 2 weeks after that letter, James Davidson had fallen ill. 3 days later, he was dead. The official cause was listed as typhoid, but Elizabeth's frantic letters to her sister suggested she believed something else entirely, that whatever had taken residence in Thomas had somehow moved to James. Thomas himself had died a month later, after what the newspaper delicately described as a period of disturbing behavior, culminating in self-harm. The Davidson parents had left the mansion shortly afterward, their fortune mysteriously depleted, and both had died within 5 years, William from suicide, Elizabeth in an asylum. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. It was Mrs. Clark. "Miss Blackwood?" Her voice sounded strained. "Something's happened. I think you should come back to the house." "What is it?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her coat. "It's my son, Tyler. He's been acting strangely since your visit. And this morning I found him standing in front of the mirror saying he wasn't Tyler anymore." Mrs. Clark's voice broke. "He said his name was Thomas." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Have you called a doctor?" "Yes, they think it's some kind of dissociative episode, possibly triggered by suggestion, meaning your questions about the house history." There was a hint of accusation in her voice. "But that doesn't explain the other thing." "What other thing?" "His shadow, Miss Blackwood. When he stands in the light, it doesn't match his movements. It's like it's moving on its own." Sarah called Michael on her way to Lake Forest, but it went straight to voicemail. As she drove through the darkness, rain beginning to pelt her windshield, she tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps Tyler Clark had overheard their conversation about Thomas Davidson and was acting out a fantasy. Perhaps Mrs. Clark, already primed with stories of the house's haunted history, was seeing things that weren't there. But none of that explained the shadow in the photograph, the undeniable, documented evidence that something had been wrong with Thomas Davidson in 1897, long before anyone currently involved had been born. By the time Sarah arrived at the mansion, it was after 9 o'clock. The house stood dark except for lights in the front rooms. Mr. Clark answered the door, his face tight with anger. "My wife shouldn't have called you," he said. "Tyler's resting now. The doctor gave him a sedative." "I understand you're upset," Sarah said carefully. "But I think there might be a connection between what's happening with your son and the history of this house specifically. What happened to Thomas Davidson?" Mr. Clark's expression hardened. "There is no connection. My son had an anxiety attack, nothing more. I want you to leave now." From upstairs came a sudden crash, followed by Mrs. Clark's scream. Mr. Clark turned and ran toward the sound, Sarah close behind him despite his objections. They found Mrs. Clark backed against the wall in Tyler's bedroom, her face pale with terror. Tyler stood by the window, but something was terribly wrong with his posture. His limbs seemed too stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. When he turned to look at them, his expression was cold and calculating, utterly unlike a child's. "Tyler?" Mr. Clark stepped forward cautiously. "Tyler is sleeping," the boy said, his voice oddly flat. "I am Thomas, and I have been waiting a very long time for someone to see me again." The silence that followed Tyler's or Thomas's statement seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing to process what she was witnessing. Mr. Clark moved toward his son, his face a mask of disbelief and growing fear. "Tyler, this isn't funny. You're scaring your mother." The boy smiled, a cold expression that looked wholly unnatural on his young face. "I told you, Tyler isn't here right now." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "But you knew that already, didn't you? You saw me in the photograph. You saw my shadow." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "What happened to you, Thomas? What happened in 1897 when that photograph was taken?" Mrs. Clark made a small, frightened sound. "What are you doing? Don't encourage this!" But Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the boy. Something in his posture shifted subtly, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "It was there before the photograph," he said quietly, "in the house, in the shadows. My parents didn't believe me when I told them something was following me." His voice took on a sing-song quality that raised the hair on Sarah's arms. "It followed me for weeks, watching, waiting, And then when the photographer came with his big camera and his flash powder, "The flash," Sarah whispered, a theory forming. The bright light cast shadows, made it visible somehow. Thomas nodded, using Tyler's body. It saw its chance. In that moment of blindness after the flash, when everyone was blinking away the spots in their vision, it stepped into me. It's like putting on a coat. He looked down at Tyler's hands with a kind of detached curiosity, just like I'm wearing this boy now. Mr. Clark lunged forward suddenly, grabbing his son by the shoulders. "Stop this! Tyler, wake up!" The boy's face contorted in rage, and with strength that shouldn't have been possible for a child his size, he shoved Mr. Clark away. The man stumbled backward, nearly falling. "Don't touch me!" the boy snarled. Then just as quickly, his expression softened into something more calculating. "I'm sorry. That was rude of me. I've just been alone for so long, you see. It's, disorienting to be seen again." Sarah's mind was working frantically. If there was any truth to what was happening, and the rational part of her brain was still screaming that there couldn't be, then something had passed from Thomas to his brother James in 1897. And now, somehow, it had attached itself to Tyler. "What are you?" she asked. "Not Thomas. The thing that took Thomas. What are you?" The boy's smile widened. "Clever woman. Thomas is just the name I'm using now. I've had many names in many places. I'm a traveler, you might say. I move from shadow to shadow looking for suitable vessels." He gestured at Tyler's body. "This one is quite comfortable." Mrs. Clark had begun to sob quietly, still pressed against the wall. Mr. Clark stood protectively in front of her now, his face pale. "Get out of my son," he said, his voice shaking with equal parts fear and rage. "Or what?" Thomas asked, almost curious. "What will you do to me without harming your precious boy?" Sarah felt a vibration in her pocket, her phone. Pulling it out, she saw a text from Michael. "Found something about the Davidson case." "Where are you?" She quickly typed back. "At the mansion. Emergency. Come now." Looking up from her phone, she saw that Thomas was watching her intently. "Calling for help?" he asked. "It won't matter. No one could help Thomas Davidson. No one could help James. And no one can help Tyler." Sarah took a step forward, forcing herself to appear calmer than she felt. "Tell me what you want. There must be something you're looking for." The thing wearing Tyler's face seemed to consider this. "What I want? I want what I've always wanted. To experience life. To feel. When you exist as I do between shadow and substance, you forget what it's like to touch, to taste, to feel warmth." A look of genuine longing crossed his face. "Do you know what it's like to be cold for decades? To watch the world but never be part of it?" Despite herself, Sarah felt a flicker of pity. But then she remembered Elizabeth Davidson's letters describing what had happened to her sons, and her resolve hardened. "You can't stay in Tyler," she said firmly. "You're hurting him, just like you hurt Thomas and James." The boy's expression darkened. "I didn't mean to hurt them. They weren't strong enough, that's all. This one might be different." He smiled again, a terrible smile on a child's face. "Shall we find out?" Michael arrived at the Davidson mansion 20 minutes later, clutching a folder of documents and looking bewildered by Sarah's urgent summons. His confusion only deepened when he took in the scene. The Clarks huddled together on Tyler's bed. Sarah standing near the door, and Tyler himself sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at his own shadow cast by the bedside lamp. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his eyes darting between them. "The entity that was in the Davidson photograph, the one casting Thomas's shadow. It's here," Sarah said in a low voice. "It's in Tyler now." Michael stared at her, then at the boy.
"Sarah."
I know how it sounds," she cut him off. "But you need to trust me. Something is very wrong here. And it's connected to what we found in that photograph. Tyler Orr, the thing controlling him, looked up at Michael with interest. "Another historian," he remarked. "You people are always so concerned with the past, always digging up things that should stay buried." Michael took an involuntary step back, his skepticism visibly shaken by the unchildlike manner and voice coming from Tyler. "I found more information about the Davidson family," he said to Sarah, his voice unsteady. "After the deaths of the boys, there were rumors, strange rumors about the family photograph. People claimed they could see something wrong with Thomas in it, though descriptions varied. Some said his eyes were different in the picture, others that his shadow didn't match. The photograph was exhibited briefly at the Chicago World's Fair in 1900, and afterward there were reports of visitors falling ill after viewing it." The thing wearing Tyler's face laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "They saw me. Some of them, anyway. The sensitive ones." "The photograph was eventually removed from public display," Michael continued, unable to take his eyes off Tyler. "Elizabeth Davidson tried to destroy it before she was committed to the asylum. but William had already donated it to the Historical Society. In her final writings from the asylum, she claimed that the shadow that took my boys was still in the photograph, waiting for someone to let it out again. Sarah felt cold despite the warmth of the room. And then I digitized it, enhanced it. I made the shadow visible again. You gave me a window, the entity said, standing up with a fluid grace that seemed wrong in a child's body. A way back into your world. I should thank you. Mr. Clark suddenly stood up. I've heard enough of this insanity. I'm calling the police. The police? The thing in Tyler laughed again. And what will you tell them? That your son is possessed by a shadow from an old photograph? They'll take him away, pump him full of drugs, and I'll still be here. Is that what you want? Mr. Clark faltered, the phone halfway to his ear. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together what she knew. The entity had moved from Thomas to James in 1897, presumably after Thomas became too weak to sustain it. It had existed somehow in the photograph for over a century until Sarah's digital enhancement had given it enough ... what? Energy, recognition, whatever the mechanism, it had found its way to Tyler, the current occupant of Thomas's old room. Light and shadow, she murmured, remembering what the entity had said about the photographer's flash. It needs light to cast a shadow, but it lives in the shadows ... She turned to Michael. Do you have the original photograph with you? He nodded. It's in my car. I brought everything I found, including the original glass plate negative that was in deep storage. Get it, Sarah said urgently. Both the print and the negative. As Michael hurried out, the entity wearing Tyler's face watched Sarah with growing suspicion. What are you planning? It asked, a new edge to its voice. I want to understand you better, Sarah said, trying to sound sincere. If you've been trapped in that photograph all this time, maybe we can help you find a better way to exist than taking over children's bodies. The entity tilted Tyler's head, studying her. You're lying, it said finally, but it doesn't matter. You can't stop me. No one could stop me in 1897. And no one can stop me now. Michael returned with a preservation box containing the original photograph and the glass negative. Sarah took them carefully, her mind working through possibilities. If it came through the photograph, she said to Michael in a low voice, maybe it can be sent back the same way. That's assuming any of this is real and not some kind of mass hysteria or suggestion, Michael replied, though his voice lacked conviction as he watched Tyler move about the room with unnatural, fluid movements. Look at him, Sarah whispered. Does that look like suggestion to you? Tyler had begun to examine his own hands again, flexing the fingers as if testing their capabilities. Then he turned to look at his shadow on the wall, and the shadow moved independently, raising a hand to its face when Tyler's real hand remained at his side. Mrs. Clark whimpered, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. We need to try something, Sarah said. The entity mentioned the flash of the camera in 1897, the bright light that cast shadows, made it visible, and gave it a chance to cross over. She looked at the glass negative in its protective sleeve. What if we reverse the process? Use light to force it back into the negative. That's, Michael began, then shook his head. I was going to say that's crazy, but all of this is crazy. What do you have in mind? Sarah glanced at her phone, checking the time. It's almost midnight. That's when I first noticed the shadow in the digital image. Maybe there's significance to that. The entity had gone very still, watching them with Tyler's eyes that now seemed older, colder than any child's should be. You can't send me back, it said softly. I won't go back to the darkness, to the cold. For a moment, Sarah almost felt sorry for it again, this ancient, lonely thing that just wanted to feel warmth and life. But then she looked at the terrified parents, at the child whose body had been stolen, and her resolve hardened. We have to try, she said, for Tyler's sake. Midnight approached as Sarah arranged the original photograph and glass negative on Tyler's desk. Michael had helped her clear the space, while the Clarks kept a watchful distance. The entity inhabiting Tyler observed their preparations with wary interest, occasionally testing the limits of its control by making Tyler's shadow move independently on the wall. What exactly is your plan? Michael asked in a low voice as they worked. I'm not entirely sure, Sarah admitted. But if this thing crossed from the shadow world into our world through the photograph, there might be a way to reverse the process. The negative is the inverse of the photograph. What was shadow becomes light, and what was light becomes shadow. Michael looked skeptical but nodded. And you think midnight is significant because ... In folklore, midnight is often considered the time when the barrier between worlds is thinnest, Sarah replied. And more practically, that's when I first noticed the anomaly in the digital image. There might be a connection. The entity laughed suddenly, making them both jump. You're grasping at straws, it said through Tyler's mouth. Playing with shadows and light like children. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Then educate us, Sarah challenged, turning to face it. What are you? Where do you come from? The entity made Tyler pace slowly around the room, his movements still unnaturally fluid. I am very old, it said eventually. I existed before your civilization, before your species learned to capture images in silver and glass. It gestured at the photograph. We, my kind, have always lived in the shadows, watching your world. Usually that's all we can do. Watch. But sometimes when conditions are right, we can ... Visit. By possessing people, Sarah said flatly. The entity shrugged Tyler's shoulders. We prefer to think of it as sharing. We get to experience life through your bodies, your senses. Is that so terrible? You killed Thomas and James Davidson, Michael pointed out. An unfortunate outcome, the entity replied, seeming genuinely regretful. They were young, fragile. I didn't understand how to moderate my presence. I've learned since then. Tyler will be fine as long as I'm not forced out too quickly. Sarah checked her phone again. 5 minutes to midnight. We need to set up some light sources, she said to Michael. Something we can use to cast strong, directed light at the negative. Michael quickly gathered the bedside lamps, positioning them around the desk. Sarah placed the original photograph next to the negative plate, noting how the shadow behind Thomas Davidson seemed darker, more defined than it had been in the digital scan, as if proximity to Tyler had somehow strengthened it. What do you hope to accomplish? The entity asked, moving Tyler closer to the desk. Even if you could force me back into the negative, what then? I would still exist. Someone else would eventually find me just as you did. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, but it won't be Tyler who suffers. 1 minute to midnight. Sarah arranged the lamps to shine directly on the negative from different angles, creating a crisscrossing pattern of light and shadow across its surface. The glass plate seemed to absorb the light in an unusual way, the image on it shifting subtly as the angle of illumination changed. Get ready, she told Michael, who stood by the light switch. To the Clarks, she said, stay back and whatever happens, don't interfere. At precisely midnight, Sarah nodded to Michael, who flooded the room with light from the overhead fixture while she simultaneously switched on all the lamps directed at the negative. The sudden brightness was disorienting, spots dancing in her vision, reminiscent, she realized, of what the Davidson family must have experienced with the photographer's flash powder in 1897. The entity screamed, using Tyler's voice, but with an inhuman quality that made the sound unbearable. Tyler's body convulsed, his back arching unnaturally as the shadow behind him on the wall seemed to tear itself away, stretching and distorting. It's working, Sarah shouted over the noise. Keep the lights on. And the shadow on the wall writhed, no longer resembling a boy's silhouette but something older, more primal, a darkness with depth and substance that seemed to both absorb and reflect the light in impossible ways. It stretched toward the negative on the desk, drawn to the inverted image like metal to a magnet. Tyler collapsed to the floor, his body suddenly limp. Mrs. Clark cried out and rushed to him, cradling his head despite Sarah's warning to stay back. The shadow flowed across the wall, across the floor, and onto the surface of the glass negative. The plate seemed to vibrate, the image on it blurring and resharpening as the shadow merged with it. For a moment, Sarah thought she could see a face in the darkness, sentient, hungry, and filled with rage. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadow vanished, and the negative lay still on the desk, appearing no different than before except for a subtle darkening of the area around Thomas Davidson's figure. The room fell quiet except for Mrs. Clark's soft sobs as she held her son. Tyler's eyes fluttered open, confusion plain on his face. "Mom?" he said, his voice normal again, a child's voice. "What happened? Why is everyone in my room?" Sarah sagged against the desk, relief washing over her. Michael stood frozen by the light switch, his face pale with shock at what he had witnessed. Did we ... Did we just exorcise a shadow demon? He asked incredulously. Sarah looked at the negative and photograph on the desk. I think we sent it back where it came from, or at least back where it's been trapped for the last century. Mr. Clark helped his wife get Tyler back into bed, the boy already drifting back to sleep as if waking from a strange dream he couldn't quite remember, when he returned to where Sarah and Michael were carefully repacking the photographic materials. His face was a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. What do we do now? He asked quietly. How do we make sure this never happens again? Sarah secured the negative in its protective case. We need to ensure this negative is properly contained. Not destroyed. I don't think destruction would eliminate the entity, just release it again, but stored somewhere it can't affect anyone else. The society has a secure vault, Michael suggested. Climate-controlled, limited access, and we could create a special protocol for this item. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were drawn to Tyler's peaceful form on the bed. The boy seemed unharmed by his ordeal, but she couldn't help wondering if there would be lasting effects, memories or nightmares that might surface later. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the shadow on the wall beside Tyler's bed. A normal shadow now, moving only when the boy moved, exactly as it should be. A week later, Sarah sat in Harold Winter's cluttered home office, surrounded by books on photographic history and paranormal phenomena. The elderly archivist had been more receptive to her story than she had anticipated, listening without interruption as she recounted the events at the Davidson mansion. "So you believe this entity has been trapped in the negative all these years?" Harold asked when she had finished, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I think it was dormant," Sarah replied, "until I digitized and enhanced the image, bringing attention back to it after decades of being forgotten in storage. Somehow that process gave it enough, energy, recognition, whatever you want to call it, to reach out again." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "There are theories about certain photographic processes, particularly those using silver halide, having properties that can capture more than just light. The early photographers were working with chemistry they didn't fully understand, creating reactions at the atomic level that might have had unexpected consequences. Like capturing a shadow entity?" Sarah asked skeptically, though after what she had witnessed, her doubt was more habitual than genuine. "Perhaps." Harold sipped his tea. "There's a reason many cultures believed photographs could steal souls. The Davidson negative wouldn't be the first photographic object rumored to be haunted." Sarah thought about the entity's words, that it and others of its kind had existed before humans learned to capture images, living in the shadows and watching. It was a disturbing thought, the idea that just beyond normal perception, ancient intelligences might be observing from the darkness. "What troubles me," she said, "is whether we've truly contained it, or just postponed the problem for someone else to deal with in the future." Harold reached for a book on his shelf, flipping to a marked page. There are historical accounts of objects being sealed away with specific rituals, not just in religious contexts, but in scientific ones as well. Early researchers into electromagnetic phenomena developed containers lined with certain metals that could block specific wavelengths. "You're suggesting we build a special box?" Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I'm suggesting that if this entity exists at the intersection of shadow and light, there might be physical means of containing it more permanently than simply putting the negative in a vault." Harold's rheumy eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Michael mentioned the entity seemed to react most strongly to certain light conditions. Perhaps a container that prevents any light from reaching the negative would be most effective." Sarah considered Harold's suggestion. The entity had indeed reacted strongly to the directed light at midnight, as if the specific conditions had created a bridge between worlds that could be traversed in either direction. So a completely light-proof container, she mused. But wouldn't that just create perfect darkness for the entity to thrive in? Harold shook his head. "Not darkness alone. Light and its absence existing together create shadows. What I'm suggesting is a state where neither can exist in null space, in effect." The concept was difficult to grasp, but Sarah was willing to explore any avenue that might prevent a recurrence of what had happened to Tyler Clark and to the Davidson children over a century earlier. "I'll need your help with this, Harold," she said. "Your knowledge of historical photographic processes might be key to understanding how the entity was captured in the first place." Harold nodded, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "I've spent my life studying these old images, always sensing there was something more to them than mere chemical reactions on glass plates. Perhaps this is what I've been preparing for all along." As they began sketching plans for a specialized containment vessel, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Davidson negative secured in vault. Special protocols in place. But I've been thinking about something. What if there are others?" The question sent a chill through Sarah. If one such entity had found its way into a family photograph in 1897, how many others might be out there, captured in images throughout history, waiting for someone to notice them? 3 months later, Sarah stood in the newly established photographic containment unit at the Chicago Historical Society, small specialized room that few knew existed. The space had been designed according to Harold's specifications, with materials that blocked various wavelengths of light and energy. In the center stood a custom-built container housing the Davidson negative, its design incorporating elements of Faraday cages, light-absorbing materials, and what Harold referred to as certain traditional protective measures that he'd gleaned from historical texts. Michael entered, carrying a stack of papers. "The board has approved our special research division," he announced, so they still think we're just being overly cautious with degraded photographic materials. "Better they think that than know the truth," Sarah replied, running her hand over the smooth surface of the containment unit. Inside, the Davidson negative lay dormant. At least she hoped it was dormant. After the incident at the mansion, Sarah had initiated a discreet protocol to check on Tyler Clark regularly. So far, the boy showed no signs of lasting effects from his possession. His parents had decided to move away from the Davidson mansion. However, unable to feel comfortable there despite Sarah's assurance that the entity had been removed. "I've been researching other historical photographs with reported anomalies," Michael said, setting down his papers on a nearby desk. "There are more than I expected. Most are probably just photographic artifacts or damages, but after what we witnessed, we need to investigate them all." Sarah finished his thought carefully. Their work had taken on a new dimension, not just preserving history, but protecting the present from certain aspects of the past that were perhaps best left undisturbed. The Chicago Historical Society's Digital Enhancement Program had been temporarily suspended pending review of all materials, with Sarah insisting on personally examining any photograph with unusual shadows or discrepancies. "What about the Davidson family portrait itself?" Michael asked. "The print is still in circulation. The Clarks have a copy, and there are probably others." "The print seems safe," Sarah replied. "The entity was bound to the original negative, the direct capture of that moment in 1897 when it crossed over. The prints are just reproductions, images of images." Michael didn't look entirely convinced. "I hope you're right," as they continued discussing their findings. Sarah's thoughts returned to the entity's words about its kind ancient watchers in the shadows, occasionally finding ways to visit the human world. The idea still disturbed her, the notion that in the darkness just beyond human perception, something might be watching, waiting for an opportunity. She glanced at the secure container holding the Davidson negative. For now, at least, one shadow was safely contained. But Sarah knew their work was just beginning. Somewhere in the vast archives of historical photographs, in museums and private collections around the world, other anomalies might be waiting to be discovered, other shadows that didn't quite match their casters. "We should establish a network," she said suddenly. "Contact other archivists, photoconservators, historical societies. Create protocols for identifying potentially problematic images without triggering whatever awakens these entities." Michael nodded slowly. "I've already started compiling a list of contacts, but we'll need to be careful how we frame it. Most people won't believe what we're really looking for." "They don't need to believe," Sarah replied. "They just need to know what signs to watch for and what precautions to take." As they left the containment room, securing it with both physical locks and the specialized lighting system Harold had designed, Sarah felt the weight of their new responsibility. They had stumbled upon something most people would dismiss as superstition or fantasia, shadow world intersecting with their own, with entities that had perhaps influenced human myths about darkness throughout history. In her apartment that night, Sarah found herself avoiding looking directly at her own shadow, cast long across the wall by her reading lamp. It was just a normal shadow, she told herself, just the absence of light where her body blocked it, nothing more. But as she turned off the lamp and darkness filled the room, she couldn't help but wonder what might be watching from the shadows and whether, if she looked from just the right angle at just the right moment, she might see a shadow move on its own. 1 year later, Sarah stood at a podium in a dimly lit conference room in Boston, addressing a small group of archivists, photographic conservators, and museum curators who had responded to her carefully worded invitation. On the screen behind her was a series of historical photographs, each featuring subtle anomalies that most would overlook, shadows that didn't quite align, darkened areas that seemed deeper than they should be, figures whose outlines appeared slightly blurred in otherwise sharp images. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "What I'm about to share will sound incredible to many of you, but I ask that you reserve judgment until you've examined the evidence we've compiled." Over the past year, Sarah and Michael had established what they informally called the Shadow Archive, a secure database of potentially compromised historical photographs from collections around the world. Working with Harold Winters until his passing 3 months earlier, they had developed protocols for safely examining these images without activating whatever might be dormant within them. They'd also encountered 2 more incidents similar to the Davidson case, one involving a Civil War Eurodaguerreotype in Richmond, and another with a street scene from 1920s New Orleans. In both cases, they had successfully contained the entities before they could fully manifest. Though the New Orleans case had been particularly challenging, requiring Sarah to adapt their methods on the fly when the entity proved more resistant than the one from the Davidson negative. We've identified 27 images so far that display the specific markers we've associated with these dots anomalies, Sarah continued, careful to use neutral terminology. Not everyone in the room was ready to hear about shadow entities that could possess people through photographs. Each has been secured using the containment protocols outlined in the materials you've received. A hand raised in the back of the room. Dr. Blackwood, while your research on photographic preservation is impressive, I'm still unclear on why these particular anomalies require such extensive security measures. The question came from Dr. Elaine Foster, a respected photographic historian from New York whom Sarah had been especially keen to recruit to their network. Her expertise in early photographic processes was unmatched, and her position at one of the country's largest archives gave her access to thousands of historical images. A fair question, Sarah acknowledged. Perhaps it's best if I show you. She nodded to Michael, who queued up a carefully edited video taken during the incident at the Davidson mansion. They had debated whether to share this footage, aware of the risk that it might be dismissed as a hoax, but had ultimately decided that some of their colleagues needed to see the reality of what they were dealing with. The room fell silent as they watched Tyler Clark's shadow move independently of his body, the darkness behind him stretching and contorting into something barely recognizable as human. The footage ended just as the shadow began to flow toward the negative on the desk. What you just saw is not a digital effect or manipulation, Sarah said into the stunned silence. It was recorded on my phone during an incident last year involving a historical photograph from 1897. 3 of us witnessed these events along with the family of the affected child. Dr. Foster leaned forward, her skepticism visibly shaken. And you're suggesting this is ... what, exactly? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, when she either lost her audience or gained crucial allies. We believe that certain historical photographic processes occasionally captured more than just light and shadow. Under specific conditions we're still working to fully understand, these photographs become permeable boundaries between our world and something else. Something that exists in shadow and darkness, watching our world and occasionally finding ways to cross over. She expected scoffs, dismissals, perhaps even angry departures. Instead, Dr. Foster slowly removed her glasses, a look of dawning recognition on her face. The Blackwell Collection, she said quietly. Now it makes sense. Sarah exchanged a glance with Michael. They hadn't encountered that name in their research. In our archives, Dr. Foster continued, we have a sealed collection of daguerreotypes from the 1850s, donated by a photographer named Ezra Blackwell. His will specified that the images should never be displayed publicly and should be stored in complete darkness. For generations, we've honored these instructions without understanding them. She looked directly at Sarah. I've examined one of the plates once, very briefly, the shadow of a woman in the image. It seemed to turn its head as I was looking at it. A murmur went through the small audience. Another hand raised, this time from a curator at a small historical society in Maine. We have a cabinet card from 1885 that our staff refuses to handle, he said. Local legend says the subject's eyes follow you around the room, but it's more than that. People who spend too much time with it report nightmares, sensations of being watched. One by one, others in the room began to share similar accounts, photographs with unexplained properties. Images that seemed to affect those who viewed them. Historical notes warning against displaying certain works. Sarah felt a mixture of validation and unease. Their phenomenon was more widespread than she had imagined. This is why we've gathered you here today, she said when the discussion quieted. To establish a network of professionals who can identify, secure, and study these artifacts safely. The protocols we've developed significantly reduce the risk of activation while allowing for necessary preservation work. By the end of the conference, 22 institutions had agreed to implement Sarah's containment protocols and joined the informal network she and Michael had established. The Shadow Archive would now have contributors across the country, all working discreetly to identify and secure potentially dangerous historical images. As Sarah packed up her materials after the final session, Dr. Foster approached her. There's something else you should know, the older woman said in a low voice. Ezra Blackwell didn't just seal away his photographs. He left journals I've read but never fully understood until today. He wrote about the Watchers and the shadows and how certain photographic chemicals created a bridge between worlds. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a man driven to paranoia by mercury exposure from his photographic process. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. I'd very much like to see those journals. Dr. Foster nodded. I thought you might. But be careful, Dr. Blackwood. Blackwell also wrote that the more attention paid to these entities, the stronger they become. By creating your network, by focusing on them so intently, You may be making them more powerful, not less. The warning stayed with Sarah as she flew back to Chicago that evening. Looking out the airplane window at the darkness below, broken only by scattered lights of towns and cities, she couldn't help but think of the vast shadows stretching between those points of light and what might be watching from within them, gaining strength as she and her colleagues turned their attention to the boundaries between worlds. In her bag was a copy of the Davidson family photograph, not the dangerous negative which remained securely contained back in Chicago, but a standard print made long before her involvement. She had studied it countless times, always focusing on Thomas Davidson and his misaligned shadow. But now, as the plane descended through clouds toward the glittering lights of Chicago, she found herself looking instead at the other figures in the image. William Davidson, the patriarch, standing tall and proud. Elizabeth beside him, her expression unreadable in the formal pose of the era. The other children arranged neatly before them. Had they known? Had they sensed, even before the photograph was taken, that something was watching their family from the shadows? And more troubling still as she looked at the darkened corners of the photograph, at the shadows cast by furniture and fixtures in the Davidson home. Were there other entities present that day? Other watchers that had remained dormant all these years, waiting for someone to notice them? Sarah carefully returned the photograph to her bag. The work ahead would be challenging, the dangers real. But they had made a start, established protocols, built a network of vigilant experts. Whatever existed in the shadows, whatever had been accidentally captured in the silver and glass of early photographs, they would find it, contain it, and ensure it remained where it belonged, in the darkness between worlds, unable to reach into the light. As the plane touched down in Chicago, Sarah glanced at her own shadow cast on the seat beside her by the overhead reading light. Just a normal shadow, nothing more. But for a moment, just the briefest moment, she thought she saw it move slightly out of sync with her body. A trick of the light, she told herself, switching off the reading lamp. Nothing but a trick of the light.